As absurd as it sounds now, it all began with flowers, not the kind that mark anniversaries or apologies, but ones that arrived with a precision that defied coincidence. Every month, on the 10th day, a delivery man appeared at my door, holding a bouquet of white lilies and pale pink roses, always wrapped in the same cream paper, always without a note. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I thought it was sweet, perhaps my husband's quiet attempt to surprise me. But soon, admiration turned into unease. There was something almost ritualistic about the timing, the uniformity, the silence attached to each bouquet. It wasn't affection that I smelled when I bent toward the petals. It was mystery, soft and fragrant, hiding something unsaid. I remember the first delivery clearly. The man smiled, called me by name, and said, "Same address, same sender." I laughed awkwardly, assuming a mix-up. My husband, Daniel, was in the garden trimming the hedges when I showed him the flowers. He looked genuinely puzzled, said, "They're beautiful," and went back to work. His indifference felt too easy. The following month, when another bouquet arrived, he shrugged again. "Someone must like you," he joked, though the joke sounded hollow. As the months passed, the repetition became unnerving. The bouquets never changed, always lilies and roses, as if chosen to represent something sacred and forbidden. I started researching flower meanings, lilies for purity, roses for love, and found myself tangled in interpretations. A fringy belief I stumbled upon claimed that lilies, when paired with roses, symbolize love that has survived betrayal. I laughed at the absurdity, yet that detail clung to my thoughts. I even found an old scholarly debate online. Some historians argue that in 19th century Europe, such pairings were secret codes among lovers. Could that symbolism have reached my doorstep now? One morning, curiosity got the better of me. I called the flower shop listed on the ribbon. The florist confirmed the order existed, always prepaid, always anonymous. I pressed for details, but privacy laws stopped her. "I'm sorry," she said. "The sender specifically requested confidentiality." That word specifically sank deep. Whoever sent these flowers cared enough to remain unseen. That night, I waited for Daniel to mention them, but he didn't. Instead, he told me about a new client, someone delicate and cultured, who loved flowers. The words seemed harmless until I realized they echoed the bouquets themselves. My mind, once calm, began its own investigation. I started noticing small things. His cologne smelled sweeter, as if touched by floral notes. His shirts carried faint traces of perfume that wasn't mine. I told myself I was imagining it, that marriages go through strange phases of paranoia. But doubt has a way of watering itself. Once it roots, it grows wild. The 5th delivery came during a storm. The paper was damp, the ribbon loose, and yet the bouquet was immaculate, untouched by the rain. I felt a chill that wasn't from the weather. Daniel wasn't home that night. He said he was meeting a client late. I placed the flowers on the kitchen counter and watched droplets slide down the petals. I wanted to throw them away but couldn't. There was a tenderness in their arrangement, almost as if someone had known what beauty would disarm me most. By the 7th month, the delivery man no longer needed my signature. He just nodded, handed me the bouquet, and left. Routine had turned into ritual, and I into a silent participant in a story I didn't yet understand. Friends commented on the constant flowers. "You're lucky," they said. "Someone's obsessed with you." I smiled, pretending it was true. But inside, I felt haunted, as if I were living inside a message written in a language only my husband and a stranger could read. One night, I left the bouquet untouched on the dining table. When Daniel came home, he paused, looked at it longer than usual, and said softly, "They smell like memory." Then he walked away. That phrase, "they smell like memory," he played in my mind for hours. What kind of memory was he referring to? Whose? A fact I later confirmed still chills me. Scent is the sense most tied to emotional memory. Psychologists say that a single aroma can resurrect an entire past more vividly than a photograph ever could. Perhaps that's why those flowers disturbed me so deeply, because they weren't just gifts. They were ghosts of something once alive. As I lay awake that night, I realized something fundamental had shifted. The flowers were no longer just objects of beauty. They were signals, quiet but persistent, pulsing through the fragile architecture of my marriage. And for the first time, I wondered if love could bloom twice, once in light, and once in the shadows we choose not to see. The scent of those flowers began to follow me everywhere. At first, it was a faint trace in the hallway, then on Daniel's shirts, and eventually even in places he had never taken: the bouquets, the car, our bedroom, his office chair. It wasn't my imagination. I had always been sensitive to his smell. The perfume of roses mixed with the heavy sweetness of lilies became something like a signature, announcing its presence before he entered a room. I started keeping a mental log of when the scent appeared and faded. Strangely, it lingered longest after his supposed business dinners. I remember one particular evening he came home late, humming softly to himself, loosened his tie, and kissed my forehead. That's when I caught it again, that same floral whisper, but warmer, more intimate, as though it had been absorbed by skin. "You smell different," I said quietly. He smiled, distracted, poured himself a drink, and replied, "Must be the hotel soap." But hotel soap doesn't smell like lilies and roses. It was the same blend that arrived at my door every 10th of the month, as if the air itself had decided to mock me. One morning, while changing the bed sheets, I found a faint smear of pink pollen on his pillowcase, a trace too light for makeup, too deliberate for coincidence. I froze, holding the fabric, realizing that evidence doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. A curious fact I once read in a psychology journal came back to me. People often overlook sensory clues in relationships because their minds filter out what feels too painful to process. Maybe that's what I'd been doing, letting my mind protect me by refusing to see. By then, the routine of deliveries had become unbearable. I tried throwing one bouquet away before he came home, thinking maybe the absence would provoke a reaction. It didn't. He didn't even ask. That silence frightened me more than the flowers ever did. When someone stops noticing beauty, it's often because they already know where it came from. I started questioning everything: his tone, his silences, his casual gestures. Once, while cleaning his desk, I noticed an unfamiliar brand of perfume bottle tucked behind his documents. I picked it up. The name on the label read Fleur de Lune. It was the same note the lilies carried, that faint nocturnal sweetness. My chest tightened. I sprayed it once into the air, and for a moment, it felt like the room filled with someone else's presence. That's when I realized scent was her way of being here. I confronted him indirectly that night, testing his reactions. "Do you believe smell can carry emotion?" I asked as we sat at dinner. He laughed softly, said, "You and your strange thoughts." Then he added, almost to himself, "Though, yes, sometimes, one scent can bring back everything." He didn't look at me when he said it. There's a curious debate among scholars about the link between scent and fidelity. Some argue that olfactory memory is the most dangerous kind, impossible to erase, capable of binding lovers through invisible threads long after they part. Others dismiss it as mere chemistry. But as I sat there across from him, feeling that perfume curl through the air between us, I no longer doubted which side was right. Chemistry can betray you just as thoroughly as a heart. I started noticing the perfume outside of our home too. Once, while shopping downtown, a woman brushed past me wearing it. I turned, my pulse quickening, half expecting to see a face that would explain everything. But there was only a stranger, disappearing into the crowd. Still, I followed her for several blocks, hypnotized by that fragrance like a moth to flame. It was irrational, even desperate. But part of me hoped she might turn, reveal something: a clue, a connection, an ending. She didn't. She vanished into the noise of the city, leaving only the ghost of the scent behind. That night, I dreamed of petals falling across our bed, layering the sheets until I couldn't find him beneath them. When I woke, the house was quiet, sunlight slicing across the floor. Daniel was gone to work, but the scent of lilies lingered faintly, mocking my restless mind. I thought of all the ways flowers are used in rituals: weddings, funerals, offerings, and wondered which ceremony mine belonged to. My mother used to say that every marriage has its own language, and when one partner stops translating, the other starts guessing. That's what I'd become. A translator of silences, decoding scents and gestures like hidden words. I wanted proof, but I also feared what proof would cost me. Still, one truth was already blooming in the quiet corners of my mind. Whoever sent those flowers wasn't sending them to me. They were sending them through me. And that realization, soft as perfume, sharp as betrayal, marked the moment my curiosity turned into suspicion, and my suspicion into resolve. I didn't yet know it, but the next bouquet would come missing something, and in that absence, I would finally begin to see the truth. It happened on the 10th again, as though the universe itself were keeping count. The delivery man arrived as usual, nodding politely, his cap pulled low against the afternoon sun. But when I took the bouquet into my hands, something felt different, lighter, incomplete. The cream wrapping paper was thinner, the ribbon tied in a careless knot instead of its usual neat bow. It wasn't until I set the flowers on the kitchen counter that I realized what was missing: the small blank card that had always been tucked among the petals. I searched the bouquet, gently parting the blossoms, careful not to bruise them, but found only a torn corner of white cardstock, a fragment with nothing written on it. That missing card was like a hole torn in a pattern I had learned too well. The absence felt loader than any message could have. I tried to shake it off, telling myself perhaps the florist had forgotten, but something in me insisted otherwise. That night, while Daniel worked late again, I retrieved the bouquet from the vase and began examining it as if it were a crime scene. That's when I saw it, the faintest trace of handwriting on the torn edge, a single curve of ink, not enough to form a letter, but undeniably human. Someone had written something and removed it in haste. I placed the fragment inside my journal, as though preserving evidence of a whisper. My pulse quickened with a strange excitement, fear, and curiosity braided together. There's a saying among forensic linguists that people reveal more in what they erase than in what they write. I began wondering what words had been deemed too dangerous to send. The next morning, I called the florist again. This time, the woman on the line hesitated before answering. The order was adjusted recently, she admitted. Same sender. But they requested the bouquet to be simpler. New card this time. Her tone softened, as if she realized she had said too much. They also asked to change the wrapping paper to make it look more natural. Natural. That word echoed in my mind. What was once ritualistic had now turned casual, intimate, as if formality was no longer needed. I thanked her and hung up, but my hands trembled. Whoever the sender was, they were growing bolder, or perhaps more desperate. A curious historical knot crossed my mind. In Victorian times, lovers used florography-coded messages through flowers to communicate what words could not. A missing card, then, might signify not forgetfulness, but silence loaded with meaning. Scholars still debate whether these floral codes were romantic gestures or tools of manipulation. Standing in my kitchen, surrounded by petals and doubt, I began to think they were both. That evening, when Daniel came home, I tried to read his face. He seemed tired but distractedly content, humming as he set his keys down. I asked if he'd noticed anything different about the bouquet. He looked at it briefly and said, "I didn't realize you kept track." There was a faint edge to his voice, defensive, almost irritated. That reaction, small but sharp, told me more than any confession could. Later that night, while he showered, I searched his study. I told myself it was wrong, that privacy should still mean something, but the weight of the missing card pressed harder than guilt. I opened drawers carefully, checked between folders, under the lining of boxes. Nothing. Then, in the bottom of a drawer filled with receipts, I found a single rose petal, dry, pressed flat, as if hidden there long ago. Its color was darker than any of the bouquets I'd received, a deep crimson that had long since lost its perfume. I held it between my fingers, feeling the fragility of its texture. It felt like touching a secret. A peculiar thought came to me, then, not entirely rational but persistent. What if these flowers weren't just sent to me but to him? What if I was only the caretaker of a message never meant for my eyes? That idea sat with me through the night, unsettling but oddly clarifying. Sleep refused to come. Around Doisa. I got up, padded barefoot to the kitchen, and stood before the vase. The lilies glowed faintly in the light from the street lamp, their petals open like silent mouths. The air smelled too sweet, almost cloying, like grief pretending to be beauty. I whispered aloud, "Who are you?" not expecting an answer. But the stillness of the house felt almost alive, listening. The next morning, the torn corner of the missing card caught the morning light on my desk, a small spark of white among shadows. I thought of writing my own note and slipping it into the next bouquet, a challenge disguised as politeness. "I know you're there." But I didn't. Some part of me wanted the game to continue, to see how far the invisible sender would go. A fact I once read surfaced again, one I had dismissed before. In long-term deception, patterns often erode before truths, emerge small inconsistencies, like a forgotten card, signal that the lie has grown too heavy to carry flawlessly. Maybe that's what was happening now, the sender slipping, the facade cracking. That night, as Daniel lay beside me, I listened to his breathing steady, slow, peaceful. The scent of roses lingered faintly between us. I closed my eyes and imagined another woman somewhere, perhaps holding the same perfume on her skin, breathing the same fragrance, dreaming of him too. And though I didn't yet know her name, I felt her presence as clearly as if she were lying on the other side of him, invisible but real. It began with interruptions subtle at first, then unmistakable. Daniel's phone would ring late at night, the screen flashing downwards on the table before he quickly silenced it. "Work," he'd murmur, his tone casual but his eyes elsewhere. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. But I had already learned that lies rarely announce themselves with words. They live instead in pauses, in breaths that arrive half a second too late. One evening, while we were having dinner, the phone buzzed again. He excused himself, stepped into the hallway, and lowered his voice. From the kitchen, I could only hear fragments. "No, not tonight. I told you. She's here." The words were like pebbles thrown into still water. The ripples reached me even in silence. When he returned, his face had the calmness of someone who had rehearsed normalcy. "That was about the project," he said, smiling faintly. I didn't ask which project. We both knew I wouldn't. The next day, while folding laundry, I found an unfamiliar earring tangled in one of his shirts. It was small, silver, shaped like a teardrop. I held it between my fingers, feeling its weight. Not mine. Not anyone I knew. He claimed it must have fallen from a client's bag, perhaps caught during a handshake. I nodded because confronting a lie too early sometimes means losing the chance to see its full design. But the signs grew louder. He started taking calls from the car, sometimes parking just beyond the gate, talking for long stretches in hushed tones. When I asked who it was, he said, "It's complicated." That word complicated can mean so many things. To me, it meant dangerous. A curious sociological study I once read explored how infidelity begins not with desire, but with disconnection, small emotional absences that widen until someone else steps in to fill them. I thought of that often in those days, wondering whether Daniel's silence was a symptom or a cause. We had once spoken about everything: books, films, politics, but now, conversations ended before they began. The house echoed differently, like the air had rearranged itself around a secret. One night, while he was showering, I glanced at his phone. It was unlocked, as though daring me. My heart raced. I hesitated only a second before opening his messages. The recent texts were gone, deleted, but one notification remained in the recently deleted folder. It was a single message: "I miss how you smelled after rain." New name, new number. Just that line. Poetic and damning. I stared at it until the words blurred. Then, without thinking, I locked the phone and placed it back, my hands trembling. When he came out of the bathroom, steam trailing behind him, he looked at me and smiled. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. But something inside me had already broken into two selves, the woman who wanted to believe him and the woman who finally couldn't. The following week, his late-night calls turned into overnight absence. "Client emergency," he said. "Presentation tomorrow." Yet each time he returned, he smelled faintly of the same floral perfume. That scent had become the third person in our marriage, invisible, persistent, cruel. I began to write down everything, dates, times, phrases, not out of paranoia, but to make sense of the pattern. There was always a call on the 8th or 9th, and a bouquet on the 10th. That couldn't be coincidence. I even tested it. 1 month, I asked him to spend the 10th away on a business trip. The flowers arrived anyway, on time, perfectly arranged. The universe, it seemed, was more punctual than he was. That night, I sat by the window, the bouquet glowing in the lamplight, and I thought about how love stories decay. Psychologists still debate whether betrayal destroys trust or merely exposes its illusion. I wasn't sure which I believed, but I knew that my reality had shifted. I was now both the betrayed and the detective, the wife and the witness. Daniel started avoiding my eyes, sensing the shift in air between us. One evening, I caught him staring at the flowers, his expression unreadable. "You should throw those out sooner," he said softly. "They die fast." The irony stung. I wanted to ask if he meant the flowers or us. Instead, I said nothing. I waited until he went to bed, then took the vase to the sink and poured out the water. The stems bent under my grip, their fragility startling. Beneath one lily petal, I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a faint smudge of lipstick. Palely rosy, almost the same hue as the flower itself. I stared at it until I could no longer breathe. That discovery shifted everything from suspicion to certainty. There was another woman, and she was no longer hiding. Whether by carelessness or cruelty, she had left her mark for me to find, a declaration written not in words but in stains and scent. That night, I dreamed of standing in a field of lilies, endless and white, each one whispering a name I couldn't quite hear. When I woke, Daniel was gone again. Only his cologne lingered, and under it, faint but undeniable, that same perfume of roses and rain. I looked at the clock. It was the 9th. Tomorrow, the flowers would come again. But this time, I would be waiting at the door, not for the bouquet, but for the truth that always arrived with it. I arrived at the flower shop a few minutes before opening. The street still hinted with that pale morning light that makes even ordinary things look newly washed. The bell above the door chimed when I pushed it, and a woman glanced up from behind the counter where buckets of roses stood like small chorises. She was in her 50s, with quick hands and a cautious smile. I recognized her voice instantly. The same softness I had heard on the phone, telling me about adjustments and privacy. "I'm a bit early," I said, and she nodded as if early was a language she spoke fluently. She kept trimming stems, not inviting conversation and not refusing it. The shop smelled of wet leaves and sugar water. In the back, I heard the soft gargle of a refrigerated case and the muffled click of a timer, a metronome for petals. "I think you know me," I added, placing my palms on the counter to steady them. "The lilies and roses, the 10th of every month." She set the shears down. "Yes," she said carefully. "You're the recipient." The word carried an odd distance, like I was a post office box. "I need to know who sends them." Her eyes flickered to the calendar taped beside the register. The 10th had a small asterisk next to it, marked in pencil. Nothing else on the page bore that mark. "We can't disclose clients," she replied. "It's policy." "Policy," I repeated, hearing how flat my voice had become. "Then maybe you can tell me what the client asks for." A pause. She folded a ribbon in her handscream. Satin, the same shade that always arrived at my door, and smoothed it, as though soothing an animal. "Sometimes clients have personal requests," she said. "Notes about collar tone, stem length, delivery window." "What about mine?" Another pause, longer. She glanced toward the back room, then leaned in. "They insist on lilies of Casablanca and pale blush garden roses. The lilies must be 3 days from full bloom. The roses must be clipped at 80 inches exactly. The paper must be unbranded. And the delivery must occur between 11 and 1. The precision made my skin prickle. "And no card?" "Not anymore." Her mouth tightened. At first, there were small notes. Then one day, the sender called and said, "No more words. She'll understand without them." The sentence hit me like cold water. She'll understand. Which she? Me or the woman whose perfume lived on my husband's shirts? "Who called?" I asked. My voice was too quick now. "A man or a woman?" "I can't," she began, but the refusal faltered in the air. She let out a thin breath. A woman. The shop's door, timid as a delivery boy wheeled in buckets of eucalyptus and peonies. We both waited for the noise to pass, the moment suspended like a dropped petal that refuses to touch the floor. When the boy disappeared into the back, the florist lowered her voice. She was very particular, she said. Once she asked me to blindfold my assistant while I wrote down the instructions, so no one else would see the name. Blindfold? I repeated, startled into a brief, disbelieving smile. It was a scarf, she said with a helpless shrug. A pretty one. She said it was about protecting someone's dignity. A fringy tidbit I'd once read floated up, absurdly relevant. Saw me perfumers test blends on blindfolded panels to remove bias from the eye, claiming smell tells truer stories when sight is silenced. I wondered if the woman sender believed secrets were safer when people could not look at them directly. Do you remember anything else? I asked. An accent, a cough, a turn of phrase. She always asked the same question after payment cleared, the florist said, eyes softening. Did the bouquet arrive on time last month? On the 10th? Did she accept it at the door? She never said your name. Just she over and over, like a prayer. Why would she care that I accepted it? I whispered. Because acceptance can be a message, the florist said simply. Some people talk with flowers. Others listen. She reached under the counter and took out a narrow ledger. I shouldn't show you this, she murmured, already opening it, but I'm also a human being. Lines of neat handwriting hand down the page, dates, varieties, quantities, delivery windows. Beside the last 3 entries, a small notation appear adjustment applied. Next to it, card removed, hibben cannot lose, paper thinner. So it wasn't an accident, I said, the missing card. No, she answered. She said too many words can ruin the point. The florist hesitated, and she asked to change the knot. A loose knot is kinder, she said. It tells her I'm not trying to bind anything. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The loose knot had felt careless. Now it felt like a confession braided into ribbon. Look, the florist added, almost apologetically, I don't like being in the middle of other people's storms, but I've been in business 20 years. Facts matter to me. Here's one. The sender always paid in cash, always exact, and always added the same tip 10%, no more, no less. People think love is sloppy. In my experience, it's logistics. There it was. A fact, is small and solid, like a stone drop it into my palm. 10%, every time. The devotion of an engineer, the tenderness of a thief. Did she ever pick up in person? Once, she said, and her face changed, softened with something like pity. She wore a scarf, the same one she used as a blindfold for my assistant. She went to smell the lilies before we boxed them. Didn't touch them, just breathed them in the way you might breathe in an old book. She said, they smell like rain after a promise. The phrase was too intimate to belong to a stranger. I felt the room tilt slightly, the buckets of roses like small anchors keeping me from sliding away. If she comes again, will you call me? I asked, my voice rawer than I intended. I can't call you, the florist replied. But I can tell you the window she prefers. 10th, between 11 and 1. She watches from across the street, near the pharmacy. After the courier leaves your steps, she disappears. The bell chimed again, another customer, another ordinary life entering our small confessional. The florist straightened, slid the ledger back beneath the counter, and picked up her shears. I'm sorry, she said softly. Some things are not mine to tell. I thanked her and stepped outside. The day had brightened. Across from the shop, the pharmacy's glass threw back a doubled world. Street, sky, my own reflection. I stood there for too long, imagining a woman draped in a scarf, watching my door in that narrow window between time and witness. There's an open scholarly debate about whether symbols comfort or control the way rituals, flowers, repeated gestures can act, either as balm or as leash. I turned that question over as I walked home. The city's noon sounds rising. Scooters, conversations, the tremor of a train beneath the pavement. Were the bouquets a comfort for her conscience or a control over my silence? At home, the vase on the table caught the light. I traced the loose knot of ribbon with my thumb, felt how easily it would come undone, how quickly it could be tied again. I realized that even my anger had begun to smell like lilies. I wrote the time 47 Emienda Plen. On the 10th, be at the window between 11 and 1. Watch the steps, watch the street, watch the pharmacy glass for the shape of a scarf. The 10th was 4 days away, an eternity measured in petals. That night, Daniel asked what I'd done with my day. I learned, I said, that some people speak more truth with cots and timing than with words. He looked at me for a long time, as if testing whether I had finally switched on a light he'd been avoiding. Then he nodded, a motion so small I could have missed it, and said, "Timing is everything." I smiled, bitter and gentle at once. "Yes," I replied, "and sometimes timing is a person." The 10th arrived like a heartbeat I could predict but never calm. By 11 I was already by the window, curtains drawn just enough to see without being seen. The florist's words looped in my head. She watches from across the street, near the pharmacy. My coffee sat untouched, cooling beside the vase of last month's fading bouquet. I watched every passerby, the postman, a mother with her child, a man carrying groceries, each one briefly a suspect until they weren't. At 11:42, the delivery van turned onto the street. My pulse quickened, every muscle tightening as though bracing for impact. The courier stepped out, bouquet in hand, cream paper glowing in the daylight, that familiar satin ribbon trailing like a soft confession. He rang the bell. I didn't answer immediately. I wanted to see her first, the watcher, the ghost behind the flowers. As he waited, I turned my gaze toward the pharmacy. For a long moment, I saw nothing. Then, a flash of pale blue fabric catching light. A woman, standing half behind the display window, a scarf draped over her shoulders. She wasn't moving. She wasn't pretending to shop. She was watching my door. The courier rang again. I opened the door, signed without looking at the paper, and forced my hands not to shake as I took the bouquet. When I looked back across the street, she was gone. Just the reflection of the glass and the faint echo of movement. I closed the door gently, holding the bouquet like evidence. My mind raced. She had seen me. She had wanted to. The act was no longer about secrecy, it was performance. Ritual, maybe even penance. On the kitchen counter, I unwrapped the flowers carefully. This time, the ribbon was darker, a blush pink instead of cream. Inside, among the lilies and roses, there was something new. A single sprig of lavender. It didn't belong. The florist had said the sender never changed the combination. I touched it gently, and a few grains of dried purple dust fell onto the table. I searched for a note, but there was none. Yet I could feel the message, as if it were humming in the silence. A change had begun. Lavender, the scent of calm, but also of farewell. A fact I later found confirmed what instinct had already whispered. In flower symbolism, lavender can mean devotion remembered, or love transformed by time. The debate among historians is whether that meaning was meant for comfort or for letting go. At that moment, I didn't care about the scholars. I knew this was not a coincidence. I carried the bouquet to the bedroom and placed it on the dresser. The fragrance spread slowly, climbing the air, wrapping around me like invisible hands. When Daniel came home that evening, I waited to see his reaction. He froze for a split second when he saw the lavender. It was brief, a flicker, but I caught it. "You changed the flowers this time," he said casually, walking closer. "I didn't," I answered, watching his face. He frowned slightly, then nodded. "Pretty, though." I studied his eyes. "Do you know what lavender means?" He paused, thinking. "Relaxation? It means remembrance," I said quietly. "And sometimes, goodbye." Something moved in his expression, not fear, not guilt, but a kind of sorrow that made my stomach turn. He said nothing, just walked to the kitchen for water. I stayed still, staring at the flowers that now seemed to pulse with quiet intention. Later that night, I found him sitting in the dark living room, the television off. The glow from the street lamp cut across his face, tracing the exhaustion there. "Daniel," I said softly, "who sends the flowers?" He didn't answer right away. Then, very calmly, You already know, don't you? I felt my throat tighten. I think I do, but I want to hear you say it. He sighed, long and heavy, then stood. Sometimes, saying something gives it too much power. I wanted to scream. Instead, I said, then maybe silence is what gave it power in the first place. He walked past me toward the stairs without another word. I stood there, listening to his footsteps fade, each one marking a distance that felt permanent. That night, I dreamed again, this time not of endless lilies, but of lavender fields under a gray sky. In the dream, someone walked ahead of me, face hidden by a scarf, scattering petals as she went. Every time I tried to catch up, the distance grew. When I woke, dawn had just begun to stretch across the sky. Daniel's side of the bed was empty. The lavender sprig from the bouquet had fallen onto the floor, brittle, lifeless. I picked it up and held it to my nose. No scent left, only dust. There's a fringe belief in aromatherapy circles that when a scent suddenly vanishes from a flower, it means the energy behind its intention has been released, the message delivered, the purpose fulfilled. Standing there, barefoot, holding that dry stem, I wondered if that meant the message had finally reached me. I wasn't ready for what the next message would bring, because this time it would come not from a florist or a scarfed watcher, but from the past itself, resurfacing with a name I had almost forgotten. It started as an ordinary morning, or so I wanted to believe. The house smelled faintly of coffee and lavender from the now fading bouquet. Daniel had already left for work. His breakfast plate sat, handset in the sink, neat as always. But routine had become my enemy. It concealed too much. I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone, mind drifting in and out of the fog of suspicion, when something caught my attention. A faint buzz, then a small vibration from the counter. Daniel had forgotten his phone. For a moment, I just stared at it. The black screen reflected my face, calm and unreadable. My heart pounded so hard, I could feel it in my fingertips. I told myself not to look. I told myself trust still mattered. But the truth was, trust had already left this house maybe months ago, walking out quietly with every bouquet. I unlocked it, new passcode. He must have disabled it recently, perhaps assuming I wouldn't dare again. Inside, the screen was almost bare. No recent messages, no call logs beyond work numbers. Too clean, too deliberate. I knew then he was deleting everything. But in his haste, he had forgotten something. The backup folder, hidden within the Notes app, buried under work memos, was a file labeled only with a flower emoji. I opened it. Inside were fragments, copied messages, maybe old ones he hadn't realized were synced. The first line read, "You shouldn't send them this month. It's getting risky." Then another, "She'll notice if you change the ribbon again." My throat tightened. And then, "I miss the scent of your skin after I placed them by her door." By her door. I scrolled further, my hands trembling. One message stood out, more recent. The lavender was my idea. "You said she always liked calm spaces. Maybe she'll think it's hers." The signature was just an initial L. L. The name pulsed in my mind like a flare. I didn't know anyone close to us whose name began with Lore. Maybe I did once, long ago. My mind scrambled through memory, through parties, through dinner conversations. Then it came like a flicker. Livia. She had been at our wedding, a friend of Daniel's from university. I remembered her laugh, her delicate way of touching his arm when she spoke, her quiet intelligence. They had worked together briefly, years ago, before she moved away. She'd even sent us a wedding gift, an uncheeky vase, ironically shaped like a blooming lily. I had forgotten her entirely, until now. My chest tightened as 1,000 small recollections returned. Daniel mentioning her name once or twice, always casually, always past tense. I remembered seeing her photo once when he showed me an old group picture. She was standing beside him, sunlight in her hair, smiling not at the camera, but at him. I read the messages again, each word cutting deeper. The letters weren't romantic in tone. They were careful, deliberate, like two people maintaining a secret correspondence, too fragile for passion, but too real for denial. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, but instead I sat still, staring at the wall where the morning light was turning gold. The silence in the house felt immense. Later that day, I drove to Daniel's office. I didn't tell him I was coming. The receptionist greeted me politely, but her expression shifted when she saw my face. "He's in a meeting," she said. "Would you like to wait?" I nodded. She led me to the lobby, where soft music played. On the coffee table sat a stack of company brochures and a vase filled with lilies and roses. The same arrangement. My stomach dropped. I leaned closer and inhaled. The scent was identical, down to the blend of sweet and green notes. My world blurred around the edges. A man sitting nearby glanced at me, sensing something was off. I smiled weakly and sat down, pretending calm. Inside, everything was screaming. When Daniel finally appeared, surprise flickered across his face. "You're here," he said softly, but not warmly. "I forgot to kiss you goodbye this morning," I lied. My voice was too smooth, too rehearsed. He smiled faintly. "You could have called. I wanted to see you." He looked at me a second longer than necessary. "You shouldn't surprise people," he said, half joking. "It ruins the rhythm." "The rhythm?" I repeated, nodding slowly. "Yes. And some rhythms are meant to be broken." That evening, after he came home, he left his phone charging in the living room. I watched him move through the motions of domestic life-changing clothes, pouring wine, asking about dinner, and I realized how frighteningly easy it was to live beside a stranger. After he went to bed, I opened the phone again. One new message, new name, only the letter L, again. "We need to stop. I'm not well enough for this anymore. Not well enough." Something about that phrasing stopped me cold. It wasn't the tone of guilt, it was the tone of finality. I lay awake until morning, the phone on the nightstand beside me, the lavender scent fading into the dark. My mind circled one thought, relentless. What did she mean, not well enough? I spent the next day searching every corner of memory, every photo album, every piece of the past that might explain her return. That's when I found an old postcard tucked inside one of Daniel's university books. It was from Lisbon. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine. The message read, "If the flowers ever stop blooming, you'll know I've gone where gardens never fade. L. Gone where gardens never fade." It was signed years ago, long before the first bouquet arrived. A fact from an old psychology article surfaced suddenly. When people facing mortality can't confess directly, they often use repetition rituals, objects, symbols to create continuity. I didn't understand it then, but soon I would. Because the next bouquet wasn't going to be about love or guilt anymore. It would be about time running out and a farewell I hadn't been prepared to receive. We chose a place we used to love before everything turned into code and perfume linen tablecloths, a window that caught the last of the evening light, a piano in the corner playing standards softly enough to let private sentences land. The host greeted us with a professional smile that made all couples look salvageable. "Good to see you again," he told Daniel, and there was nothing unusual in his tone, only the gentleness of habit. Yet habits were exactly what frightened me now. They were where secrets learned to sit quietly and pass as furniture. We were led to a small table near the window. The room glowed in that hour that isn't quite day or night, when shadows look honest because they aren't hiding anymore. Daniel ordered a dry white, the kind we used to share in warmer months, and asked for the chef's menu. "Let's trust someone else for a change," he said, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It struck me as a line he'd practiced, the way one practices apologies in case they are needed. The first course arrived in slices of fennel and pear, a lacy of olive oil. We made a performance of eating well, of nodding at textures and temperatures, of making sounds that could be mistaken for delight. I asked about his day. He asked about mine. It wasn't conversation, it was choreography. Around us, other tables traded laughter like currency. There is an old argument psychologists still debate whether we remember happiness more accurately than pain, or whether memory simply edits itself to keep us from fracturing. As I watched his hands fold and unfold the napkin, I wondered which story we would remember later, the two of us trying, or the two of us pretending. The sommelier arrived with the bottle, and, with an affable certainty, said something that snagged the air. "Back to your usual rhythm, Mr. Daniel? Shall I bring the little bud vase she likes?" He was already turning toward the sideboard when silence made him stop. I can of course skip it, he added, as if he had offered salt at the wrong time. A thread snapped inside me, and the sound was private but unmistakable. I watched Daniel's face, how still it went for a heartbeat, then how quickly the muscles arranged themselves into calm. The fact I had once read flared like a small cold star. Micro-expressions, those unintentional flashes of emotion, can last between 125 and 15 of a second before the mask returns. I saw one then, the tiniest blink of panic, gone so quickly someone else would have missed it. "What bud vase?" I asked, politely enough that the sommelier couldn't hear the blade beneath the words. "Ah," he replied, eager to recover grace, "it's a small thing we keep for certain patrons, son sprig, nothing extravagant. Lavender." He smiled, apologetic. "A bit of the lady who sometimes joins him. She says food tastes softer when there's something floral at the table." The world tilted half a degree, yet everything stayed where it was: the piano, the glasses, the linen. I felt my breath come in too shallow, as if the air had turned to silk and I was trying to breathe cloth. Daniel cleared his throat. "We can skip it tonight," he told the sommelier evenly. "Just the wine is fine." "Of course," the man said, with the relief of someone who has put a foot wrong and been forgiven. "And for the record, tonight is a fruit day." He winked toward the bottle. "Biodynamics. People say wine is sing better on fruit days." He left us with that little fringe tidbit. The kind restaurants pass along like a charm. Some sommeliers swear by lunar calendars. Others roll their eyes. I had always filed such things under romantic nonsense. Tonight, it felt like the room itself believed in invisible pools. We sat in a hush that felt crowded. Somewhere behind me, cutlery chimmed gently, and the pianist lipped into a melody I recognized without naming. Daniel lifted his glass, then set it down. "You were right," he said softly, as if continuing a conversation we hadn't yet started. "Timing is a person." "And lavender?" I asked. "Is it a person too?" He looked at the window where our reflections sat more honestly than we did. "Some habits," he said, "begin as kindness and become cruelty by repetition." "Whose kindness?" I whispered. He didn't answer. Or perhaps the absence was an answer, the only one he could manage in a room that had been taught our preferences. The second course: commissured fish, a ribbon of citrus, a green so bright it felt like a promise. We ate because people in trouble still eat. "I didn't know they knew her," I said, my voice steady. "Here. They know many people," he replied, an answer that tried to be true by being vague. "But they don't keep a bud vase for everyone," I said. "With lavender." He rubbed his temple, a gesture that had once meant long meetings and now meant words he wouldn't say. "Let's not do this here." "Where should we do it?" I asked. "In a hallway? In the car? In the quiet spaces where you take calls and lower your voice?" He flinched, not visibly to the room, but enough that the water in our glasses trembled. "I asked you out," he said, very calm, "so we could remember we're human to each other." "Humans tell the truth," I said, "or they stop asking for knives in public places." He looked at the fork in his hand like it belonged to someone else. Then he did a strange, tender thing. He reached across the table and rested his palm flat, not touching me, leaving a span of white linen between skin and skin, as if acknowledging the distance. "I used to think secrecy protected people," he said. "Now I think it only delays the harm." The room softened around us, the light a little warmer, the piano moving into something slower. The sommelier had turned to top off our glasses. He hesitated, then set down a tiny vase in a taller than a salt shaker, holding a single stem of lavender. He couldn't help himself. "Habit is a servant that obeys even when dismissed." "Compliments of the kitchen," he said, retreating before either of us could argue. The fragrance was faint, more memory than scent. I watched Daniel's pupils tighten, just a fraction, the body's a small confession. "Does she come here often?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the lilac-gray flowers. "She used to," he said, "when work felt larger than it was, when I thought I could keep rooms separate just by closing doors." "Livia," I said, giving the letter its body. The name landed quietly, but it landed. He didn't deny it. A long moment passed, the kind that expands until you can hear your own heartbeat. Outside, the streetlights blinked alive one by one like patient witnesses. He exhaled, and a piece of the scaffolding I had balanced on for months finally gave way. "She's sick," he said, in a voice so low I felt it more than heard it. "That's not an excuse, it's a coordinate." Something fierce and helpless rose in me at once. "So you gave her lavender," I said, "and lilies, and a corner of our life." "She asked me not to tell you," he said. "She said the flowers would say enough." "The flowers said nothing," I replied, the words steady as steps. "They only kept me listening." We sat with that, 2 people and a sprig between them. The waiter cleared our plates quietly, the way kind staff clear the aftermath of a small accident without calling it by name. In the glass, I watched our reflected selves practice being brave, my jaw unclenching, his shoulders lowering, the vase like a lighthouse between 2 storm lines. There's a debate I once mocked when I read it, the kind academics publish in journals that few people finish, whether forgiveness reconstructs trust or simply buries evidence under nicer words. The question arrived now, not as theory but as a road sign with both arrows pointing into fog. He lifted his gaze to mine. "I can tell you everything," he said, "but if I do, it won't put the past back in its wrapper." "It never was," I said, glancing at the lavender, at the threads of purple so fragile I feared a breath might scatter them. "It was always lose." The pianist began the last phrase of the song, notes stretching like dusk. A couple at the next table laughed about something that would not matter tomorrow. The sommelier pretended not to watch us from the corner of his knowledge. "Pay the bill," I told Daniel gently. "Then let's go home." He nodded and signaled for the check. When the folio arrived, a small note card is laid out, with it the restaurant stationery, embossed in silver, no message, just a rectangle of possibility. He stared at it, then tucked it back in. We stood, the lavender staying behind in its little glass, a token for the next truth that would sit here. On the sidewalk, the night air felt cleaner than any decision. We walked side by side without touching, 2 people leaving a room that knew more than it should. In the distance, a pharmacy window caught our reflections again, and for a breath I thought of the woman with the scarf watching doorways as if they were clocks. We turned toward home. Neither of us spoke, but the silence had changed its weight. It no longer tried to hide, it simply walked with us, unblinking, unadorned, ready for whatever the next door would not be able to keep out. The days after that dinner moved with the strange rhythm that follows revelation, too quiet, as if the air itself feared to make sound. We didn't talk about Livia again, though her name hung invisibly between us like the faint hum of a refrigerator that you only notice once it stops. Danielle went to work each morning, kissed my cheek, and lingered a heartbeat too long as if touching something he might soon lose. I began to look for her everywhere, her shadow, her perfume, her handwriting. The obsession was almost involuntary. One afternoon, while organizing old drawers, I found a shoebox filled with mementos from our early years concert tickets, postcards, an old Polaroid. At the very bottom, under a folded napkin from our honeymoon, there was a photograph I didn't recognize. It showed 3 people. Daniel, younger, sunburned, smiling wider than I remembered he could. A friend of his from college, and beside them, a woman with long auburn hair. Her hand rested on Daniel's shoulder, light but intimate. The back of the photo was dated 15 years ago and written in faint ink, "The day before Lisbon." My stomach clenched. Lisbon, the same city on the old postcard, the one signed L. I traced her face with my thumb. She looked radiant, alive, unafraid. I wanted to hate her, but all I felt was the slow dawning of something more complicated, the sense that she had existed in his life long before me, and perhaps never truly left. When Daniel came home that evening, I placed the photo on the table beside his plate. He froze when he saw it. His shoulders tightened, then relaxed in surrender. "You found it," he said quietly. "Lisbon?" I asked. He nodded, eyes lowered. "That was a year before we met. We were close. Then life went in separate directions. And then?" He sat down slowly. "Then I thought she was gone for good. She moved abroad, started her own company, married someone else. I hadn't heard from her in years. But she came back," I said. "Yes." He rubbed his face, weary. "About 2 years ago, she emailed me out of nowhere. Said she'd been diagnosed, late stage, Asked if I remembered her favorite flower combination. I felt my throat dry. Lilies and roses. He nodded. She said she wanted them around her for whatever time she had left, but she didn't want pity or visits, just connection, the kind that doesn't require explaining. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the tenderness in his tone with the deceit it carried. So you sent her flowers? I did, once. Then she started sending them too, back and forth, like a strange conversation neither of us had the courage to end. My voice cracked slightly, and then she started sending them to me. He nodded. She said she wanted to thank you, that you gave her peace, even if you didn't know it. She believed love could exist in echoes, that it didn't have to choose a single direction. I stood, pacing, unable to look at him. You let her make me part of her farewell ritual without asking. He swallowed. I thought it would fade on its own. I thought when she stopped, I'd tell you everything. When she stopped, he looked up, eyes wet, with something between guilt and grief. The lavender was the last one. She wrote me afterward. Said her treatments had failed. That she didn't want to be remembered with pity, only fragrance. There was a long pause. I whispered, "She's dying." He nodded slowly. Maybe already gone. The clock ticked loudly, carving the air into fragile pieces. The lilies on the counter seemed too alive, their scent too cruel. A fringy notch of botanical folklore drifted through my mind. Some cultures believe flowers wilt faster in houses where secrets are dying. I glanced at the vaseune petal had already fallen, curling on the marble like a sigh. Daniel rose and walked toward the window. She asked me to forgive myself, he said. But I can't. Not for the flowers, not for what they cost you. I stared at his reflection, fragmented by glass. You don't get to decide forgiveness alone. He turned, face pale. Do you hate me? I don't know, I said honestly. I just feel like I'm living in someone else's love story. Outside, dusk gathered in slow folds. The light made the lilies glow faintly, their whiteness uncanny. I thought of Livia somewhere between presence and memory, maybe already gone, sending one final signal through petals and scent, the only language left to her. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of Daniel's breathing beside me was steady, almost childlike, and yet every inhale reminded me of the perfume that had haunted our home. I rose quietly, went to the kitchen, and took the photograph in my hands. I wanted to tear it apart, but instead, I slid it into the vase beside the lilies. Let them guard it, let time soften its edges. In the dark, a strange calm came over me. Perhaps grief, when shared between the living and the dying, becomes something else, a form of understanding too painful to name. Psychologists still argue about whether empathy can exist without forgiveness. I wasn't sure, but I knew I was starting to see the shape of a truth that wasn't just betrayal, but also love misdirected by mortality. When I returned to bed, Danielle stirred and murmured something I couldn't make out. I leaned closer, thinking he was speaking my name. But no, it was hers. Livia. The sound was soft, almost reverent. It didn't wound me this time. It only settled between us like dust that no longer needed sweeping. She came to the house on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after that dinner, the kind of gray day that sits between rain and memory. I heard the doorbell and, without thinking, went to open it myself. The air outside was thick with humidity, the smell of wet earth and exhaust tangled together. There she was, Livia. She stood on the porch holding a small paper bag, her scarf tied loosely around her neck, hair thinner than I remembered from the photograph. Her face carried the pale translucence of someone who'd been negotiating with illness for too long, yet her eyes calm, unafraid, a brightness that startled me. "Hello," she said softly, her voice more breath than sound. "You must be Anna." I nodded, too stunned to speak. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, angry confrontations, accusations, maybe even tears. But reality arrived quietly, like she had come not to fight but to lay something down. "I know this is strange," she continued, "but I didn't want to leave without seeing the woman I've been speaking to all this time, even if I never used words." She smiled faintly. "The flowers." Something inside me clenched, and I stepped aside. "You'd better come in." She entered slowly, glancing around the living room, eyes landing on the latest bouquet on the table. "They always look right here," she said. "Exactly as I pictured." I didn't answer. My voice might have betrayed too much. We sat across from each other on the edge of the couch, her with the grace of someone who has learned to conserve energy. She placed the paper bag on her lap and unwrapped a small porcelain figurine inside, a tiny angel holding lilies. "I used to give these to patients," she said, "before I became one." Her honesty disarmed me. "Why the flowers, Livia?" I finally asked. She looked down, running a finger along the angel's wing. "When I got the diagnosis, Daniel was one of the few people I wrote to. Not because I wanted him back, because he was part of a time when I still believed in beginnings. I told him I wanted something beautiful to mark what was ending. And you chose my doorstep for that?" She met my gaze. "I chose you because you were the life he built after me, because I needed to see that he hadn't destroyed himself chasing ghosts." She hesitated. "I didn't mean for it to hurt you. I thought, perhaps it might remind you both what love still looks like when it stops belonging to only one person." Her words sounded too poetic to be cruel, but cruelty lived in them anyway. "You made me feel like a stranger in my own marriage," I said quietly. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm sorry. But I didn't have much time left to ask for forgiveness properly." There was a silence that seemed to stretch the room wider. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock, the same rhythm that had haunted every lonely evening these past months. She pulled an envelope from her bag. "This is the letter I never sent. I think it belongs to you now." I took it but didn't open it. Her handwriting was careful, elegant, with the shaky grace of someone learning to write again. Then she did something unexpected. She reached into her coat and took out a small vial of perfume. "It's the blend I used for the bouquets," she said, smiling faintly. "Lilies, roses, and a trace of lavender. I called it Memoria. I wanted you to have it." I stared at the vial, unable to move. "You think I want to smell this again?" "No," she said. "But one day, you might want to understand it." Her calmness made anger impossible. "What do you do with a woman who's dying and still manages to make grace feel like a confession?" I asked. "Does Daniel know you're here?" She shook her head. "He wouldn't have let me come. He thinks I've already gone." Her voice softened. "But I needed to leave something real behind, to stop being just a scent and ribbon." A strange tenderness rose in me, then uninvited, unwelcome, but unstoppable. "You're very brave," I said, though the words felt strange in my mouth. She smiled sadly. "Not brave, just out of time." We sat for a while, not speaking. The air between us smelled faintly of lilies real and remembered. Finally she stood. "Don't blame him too much," she said gently. "He loved you, loves you still. He just didn't know how to carry two truths at once." As she reached the door, I asked, "Will you be okay?" Her eyes softened with something eternal. "I already am," she said. "When you've said goodbye enough times, even life starts to sound like one." She left before I could answer. I stood there for a long time after the door closed, the angel figurine and letter still in my hands. Outside, the air smelled of rain, the same scent that had once felt like betrayal and now, strangely, like release. Later that night, I told Daniel she had come. He sat down slowly, his hands covering his face. "She shouldn't have done that," he murmured. "She didn't come to hurt us," I said quietly. "She came to finish something." He nodded, tears sliding soundlessly through his fingers. I finally opened the letter. The first line read, "Anna, you don't know me, but you've taught me something about love that even time couldn't." The rest blurred as my eyes filled. At the bottom, one final sentence stood alone. "When the flowers stop coming, don't think of endings, think of gardens hasting before spring." I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the vase. The flowers, as if understanding, seemed to lean closer together, their petals whispering in the quiet. A fact I remembered from a science article came to me then. Lilies release more fragrance when exposed to warmth, as if they respond to human presence. That night, they were stronger than ever. And I thought perhaps love, too, releases its truest scent only when it's nearing its end. For several days after Livia's visit, the house existed in a peculiar calm, not peace exactly, but something adjacent to it, like the air that settles after a storm has broken every branch it meant to. Danielle, and I move it carefully, as if sound itself might reopen the wound. I caught him staring at the letter she had left on the table more than once, though he never touched it. Perhaps he didn't need to. The words were already inside him. The next Sunday I found him sitting in his study surrounded by photographs. Some were ours vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, but others were older, faded, the edges curled. He was looking at a picture of her, the same one from Lisbon. When he saw me, he didn't hide it. I was trying to remember what her voice really sounded like, he said quietly. I hesitated in the doorway. You could tell me. He shook his head. You wouldn't want to hear it from me. Her voice was ordinary, but it made everything sound like it could last. That kind of sentence would have crushed me once. Now it only landed gently, like truth finally allowed to breathe. And yet nothing did, I said. He looked at me with a faint, weary smile. Except this. He gestured toward the house, toward us. The strange thing that survived all the noise. I wanted to believe that. But ghosts, even kind ones, linger. Every time I passed the bouquet, every time I caught the faint scent of lilies and lavender in a corner, I felt her presence like a pulse under the skin of our lives. That night, I dreamed of her again. She was standing in a field, wearing that pale scarf, the wind bending the flowers around her ankles. She looked at me and said, "He doesn't need to remember me anymore. You can have the seasons back." I woke with tears on my face and the taste of salt in my mouth, like memory distilled into something physical. The next day, I decided to clear her last gift. I took the wilted flowers from the vase and carried them outside. Daniel followed me silently. We walked to the edge of the garden, to the small patch of soil where sunlight always lingered the longest. I want to plant them here, I said. Not as mourning, as continuity. He nodded, helping me dig. We mixed the petals into the earth, the color fading into brown, the scent rising once more before vanishing completely. When it was done, we stood there for a long time, hands dirty, breathing the damp air. There's a curious argument in botany circles about whether flowers can remember trauma, if their next bloom carries chemical echoes of damage. Some researchers say yes, plants learn, in their own silent way. Others insist that memory belongs only to creatures who can suffer. I looked down at the soil covering what had once been deception, forgiveness, and farewell, and thought maybe the same debate applies to love. That afternoon, as we washed our hands at the kitchen sink, Danielle said, she wrote to me once that she didn't want a funeral. She wanted her name to fade quietly, like perfume in an empty room. She got her wish, I said softly. He nodded. But it still feels wrong not to say goodbye properly. I turned off the tap, drying my hands slowly. Then say it. Not to her, to yourself. He did. In a low, trembling voice that carried neither guilt nor defense, he whispered her name once, then again and exhaled as if something heavy had finally left his chest. After that, something between us began to shift. He started leaving his phone unlocked again, his eyes steady when he spoke. I stopped checking the door for couriers. The silence between us became lighter, like a blanket instead of a wall. A few days later, I received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address, only my name written in delicate handwriting that trembled with illness. Inside was a short note on cream paper. Dear Anna, by the time you read this, the garden will have bloomed once more where I am. Don't let grief turn to blame, let it turn to roots. It was signed simply. Eli showed it to Daniel. He didn't cry this time. He only said, "Then it's done." We sat together on the porch that evening, watching the sky fold itself into pink and gray. The scent of freshly turned soil rose from the garden. Somewhere far away, a wind carried the faint smell of lavender, or maybe I imagined it. I never thought I'd be one of those people, I said after a while. The kind who lives inside someone else's unfinished story. You aren't, he said gently. You finished it. I didn't answer. I thought of Livia, her hands, her voice, the way she had stood in my doorway, like someone stepping between worlds. Maybe finishing wasn't the point. Maybe all we ever do is carry fragments forward, into whatever comes next. As the light dimmed, Daniel reached over and took my hand. It wasn't an apology or a plea. It was acknowledgement, quiet, steady, human. I let him hold it. That night, for the first time in months, I slept through until morning, and when I woke, the air was clean. The lilies were gone. The garden outside had already begun to sprout small green shoots. A fact from an old horticulture book drifted to mind: lilies, when cut and buried, sometimes leave behind enough of the bulb to regrow. Even from fragments, they remember how to live. So do we, I thought. The house had learned a new quiet since the garden, a hush that didn't accuse anymore. I cleaned with a steadier hand, opened windows longer, let air and sunlight insist on their rights. Perhaps that's why I found the drawer. It wasn't a discovery of cunning, only the banal choreography of dusting, a cloth, a tug, and then the soft refusal of a lock that had swollen slightly with humidity. The key was obvious in hindsight, taped beneath the writing desk, half hidden by a ridge of dried varnish. I pressed it into the lock and felt a brief resistance, like a living animal deciding whether to allow touch before it turned. Inside lay order. Envelope is stacked in 3 neat columns, each tied with thin twine, cream against the mellow wood. On top, a slip of paper with Danielle's handwriting, for when my courage matches my memory. My name wasn't on it. Neither was hers. There was only the impartiality of time keeping its own ledger. I didn't call out to Daniel. He was on the porch repairing a loose board, the tap-tap of nails a modest metronome. I sat on the floor, knees drawn up, and untied the first bundle. The top envelope had a Lisbon postmark from 15 years ago, date that matched the photograph's back. When I slid the letter free, the faintest bloom of scent, rosette ghost of paper and someone's old perfume, what librarians joke about as bibliosmia. It's a real thing. I remembered suddenly. The chemistry of aging paper releasing vanillin and lignin, a fact so ordinary it felt like a blessing. Livia's handwriting ran across the page in a confident river. Danielle, do you remember the yellow tram that made us late and therefore saved us? She began, then spiraled into the story of how missing a ferry meant catching a gallery opening that changed her work, her city, her sense of what a life could be. It wasn't a love letter, not exactly. It was a letter about attention, about the kind of looking that makes 2 people feel like the world is manageable because they are seeing it together. I read slowly, unsure which parts belonged to their past and which parts were crossing the border into mine. The second letter was years later, briefer. Married now, she wrote. You would have liked him for the way he fixes broken hinges and doesn't pretend that makes him a poet. Amor on the edge of wistfulness. I set it aside with hands that had stopped shaking. I moved it through the bundles in new sequence, pulled by instinct rather than chronology. Some were merely postcards. A street market, a museum facade, a café table with an empty chair. Others came after long silences, where something in the white spaces spoke louder than ink. And then I reached a newer stack ticker paper, the slight irregularity of handmade stock, dates from 2 years ago, 1 year ago, 8 months, 4. The ribbon on this bundle felt newer, the knot less confident. The first line of the top letter: I'm writing this with the cautious optimism of people who say stable, even when they mean not worse. I stopped and listened for Daniel's hammering. It had gone quiet. Wind moved through the screen, bringing in the smell of soil, of nails warmed by sun. I read on. She recounted the first hospital room, the good nurse with a tattoo of a tiny magnolia near her wrist, the absurd comfort of bad television. I remembered the lilies then, she wrote, and how you said they were the closest thing to silence that wasn't absence. Another letter, later. Do you remember that you used to insist lavender wasn't a flower but a verb? To lavender, to calm something without erasing it. I've started making my own blend. Lilies, roses, lavender. I call it memoria because remembering and being remembered are sometimes the same mercy. I felt the vial's weight in my mind, how it had trembled in her hand in our living room. I found an envelope without a stamp, never sent, only sealed. The flap opened easily, as if it had been closed for the ritual and not the secrecy. This one was addressed, not to Daniel, but to me. Nu name just. To the woman with the house where lilies learn our language. I exhaled, and my breath shuddered like a curtain when a door opens. Anna, it began. And I understood immediately it had been written before the visit, before the porcelain angel, somewhere between audacity and apology. I should have written sooner, but the strangest thing about dying is how busy it makes you. It turns every minute into a tiny ministry closing accounts, answering historians who live inside your friends' heads, deciding which scarf is a farewell and which is a memory. If I have wronged you, forgive me with the generosity you reserve for the weather, not because it deserves it, but because resisting it would break your umbrella. I laughed then, a small, indecorous sound in the quiet room. She was infuriating, she was precise, she was so alive on paper that death felt like a rumor. I kept reading. I sent the flowers because I wanted to give your house a rhythm that didn't depend on answers. I thought, if she opens the door each 10th day, there is still a ceremony worth keeping. Perhaps that was arrogance. Perhaps it was love misshelved. Not all the letters were hers. Near the bottom of the drawer, I found Daniel's unsent drafts, paragraphs started and abandoned, hard truths sanded into deferments. I cannot let this become a monument we bring fresh flowers to. I have a wife whose tenderness is not seasonal. Another, I am sorry for the ways compassion becomes permission when you don't call it by name. He had never mailed them. Perhaps he had told her some of it on those quiet calls in the car. Perhaps silence had done the speaking for them in the old way of people who share a history and a deadline. A packet labeled only with a small pressed petal crimson, Brittle held the letters that answered the question I had not dared to solidify: why me? The first line undid me, because if love must go through you to reach him without destroying you, then let it go through me first. She detailed the day she stood across from the pharmacy, watching the courier climb my steps, how she panicked when I took too long to open the door, how she whispered go on into her scarf like a foolish conductor. I wanted to know whether you would accept beauty even when it felt like a riddle, she wrote. You did. I am sorry for how much that demanded. I set the letters down and pressed my palms flat to the floor, needing the cool grain of wood to steady me. The urge to destroy the drawer and sanctify it in the same breath wrestled in me. I wanted to call Daniel in, and I wanted never to speak of it again. From the porch came a soft scrape, and then his voice. Anna. I gathered the letters into a single stack and placed them carefully back in their columns, the way one returns borrowed light. I left out only the one addressed to me. When he stepped into the doorway, dust clinging to his forearms, he saw the open drawer and didn't flinch. I should have shown you, he said. You should have, I agreed, and held up the letter. But she did. We sat on the floor together, knees touching, and I read the rest aloud. There is an argument, she wrote near the end, and scholars still debate whether confession unburdens only the teller or can heal the listener too. My wager is that truth is communal, even when love is not. If I am wrong, leave the letters in the dark, and time will finish what I began. I folded the page. We were very quiet. Then Daniel spoke, his voice like someone testing a new key in an old door. What do we do with the rest? Keep them, I said. But not as a shrine, as a record of how not to lie and still be kind. We retied the bundles and closed the drawer. I wiped the dust from the key and slid it back beneath the desk, not as concealment, but as acknowledgement. Some things don't need guarding once they've been witnessed. In the evening, I placed my letter inside the empty porcelain angel box, the vial beside it. For the first time, the scent didn't accuse. It simply named things. Lily, rose, lavender, and a room that had decided to go on being a room, even after it had been a chapel. That night, the garden breathed through the open window. A fringy tidbit, I'd read, perhaps apocryphal, wandered through my mind that, in certain monasteries, novices are told to smell the earth, after compline to remember that endings have a fragrance too. I didn't know if it was true, but I fell asleep imagining novices and lilies and letters folded into pockets, and I felt, not forgiveness yet, but something close enough to rehearse it. The garden bloomed early that year, as if the earth itself had read the letters and decided to respond. The lilies came first, then the roses stubborn in their return, even after being cut and buried. Their petals glowed faintly against the morning mist, the collars soft and forgiving. Daniel started spending more time outside, watering them, pruning carefully, almost reverently. I watched him from the window one morning, his movements slow, deliberate, as though tending something sacred. "Do you think they'll come back next year?" he asked one evening, kneeling by the soil. "They already have," I said. "Life after confession is strange. It doesn't return to normal. It builds something quieter, a landscape altered but not barren. Our house was different now, lighter somehow, though still marked by ghosts. The letters stayed in their drawer, untouched since the day we read them. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined the paper breathing softly in the dark, as if the words continued to live on their own, whispering to each other while we slept. Weeks passed before the next event arrived, the one that would close the circle. It was mid-morning, sunlight slanting through the curtains, when the doorbell rang again. My heart stuttered. Old reflexes die hard. Daniel looked up from his desk, hesitant. "Expecting anyone?" I shook my head. When I opened the door, a delivery man stood there, a new face this time, younger, uncertain. He held a small brown package, not a bouquet. "For Mrs. Ana," he said, "from Lisbon." My hands trembled as I signed it. The handwriting on the label was neat, unhurried. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small wooden box. The scent reached me even before I opened it, faint, familiar, unmistakable. Lavender. The box contained a single dried sprig and a folded note. Daniel stood behind me now, reading over my shoulder as I opened it. The note was written in the same looping hand that had haunted our days and redeemed them all at once. "Dear both," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I've kept my word. The last bouquet has bloomed where it should not in your home, but in the garden that began this story. I've asked a friend to send this to you after." There was a pause of space, then, "Danielle, thank you for remembering me in kindness, not in guilt. Anna, thank you for forgiving me before I earned it. You taught me something I didn't understand even while living. That love, in its truest form, is not possession but participation. And finally, when spring comes, cut the first bloom and give it away. Don't keep it. The cycle only works if it moves forward." There was no signature this time, just the initial L. Daniel sat down slowly, the note shaking slightly in his hands. "She planned even this," he whispered. "She understood endings," I said. He nodded, a small, reverent motion. Then, after a moment, he stood and went to the garden. I followed. The lilies were open, radiant under the late morning light. Daniel knelt, touched one gently, then looked up at me. "Will you?" he asked. I knelt beside him and cut the stem, careful not to bruise the petals. The fragrance rose, clean and soft, the same scent that once meant betrayal, then memory, and now something else entirely. I held it out to him, but he shook his head. "Not me. You choose." I looked around. The street was quiet, the pharmacy across the road reflecting the sun just as it had that day months ago when I first saw her silhouette. Down the sidewalk, an old woman was walking slowly, holding onto a shopping bag. I called out gently, walked to her, and offered the flower. "For you," I said. She looked surprised, then smiled, tucking the stem into her cardigan pocket. "Beautiful," she murmured. "Smells like rain." When I turned back, Daniel was watching me with a softness I hadn't seen in years. "She'd have liked that," he said. "Maybe that's the point," I replied. "It was never really about us at all." That evening, we sat on the porch, the box and note between us. The sun went down in colors that looked almost deliberate, rose into gold, gold into lavender. The scent from the garden drifted toward us, and for once, it didn't feel like memory. It felt like air natural, necessary, and free of meaning. A few days later, I sent the porcelain angel and the vial of memoria to the florist, with a note. "Thank you for delivering her story. Keep these as proof that kindness sometimes arrives disguised as mystery." She wrote back, a simple line. "Every 10th of the month, I still light a candle in the shop. Habit dies is lower than love." It made me smile. In the months that followed, I caught Daniel humming again while shaving, something he hadn't done since before the flowers began. I found myself lingering by the window in the mornings, not waiting for deliveries, just watching the garden breathe. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, I thought I smelled lilies. Sometimes I didn't. But it didn't matter anymore. There's a debate among grief counselors about whether closure is real or simply a convenient myth for those left behind. Some insist that we never close the door, we just learn to live with it open. As I watched the light play across the petals, I decided it didn't matter who was right. The door could stay open, as long as it faced the garden. I delayed the confrontation longer than I care to admit, telling myself that timing required delicacy, that storms pass more gently when invited. But storms do not RSVP. They arrive. On a Tuesday evening, while the light outside turned the garden a forgiving gold, I set 2 glasses of water on the dining table. Nothing sweet, nothing numbing. The letters stayed in the drawer, the angel in its box, the vial with the florist. I wanted only the room, the air, and the 2 of us without intermediaries. Danielle came in, still smelling faintly of sawdust from the porch repair. A scent so clean it almost persuaded me to postpone. Almost. Sit, I said. My voice is steady in the way a bridge is steady when wind tests it. He sat, hands folded, the faintest tremor in his right thumb tapping a private metronome. We had circled this moment for months, tracing it like a coastline on maps, each of us pretending we were cartographers and not sailors already at sea. I don't want fragments tonight, I began. No euphemisms. No metaphors that make us sound noble. I want nouns and dates. He nodded once, a soldier accepting terms. Ask, when did it start again? He understood I meant not the Lisbon photograph, not the undergraduate myths, but the modern thing with couriers and timing and the pharmaceutical window where she once watched our door. He took a breath that went all the way to the bottom of him. 2 years ago. An email. Subject line, a practical question. She asked about a charity we used to support, said she'd found my name in an old list. It was true, and also an excuse. Did you meet? At a cafe first. 30 minutes. 2 coffees we barely touched. She told me about the diagnosis. I told her about you. He swallowed. She asked me not to tell you because she wanted to stay a story that didn't make your days heavy. And you agreed. No. I let omission do the agreeing. The room's quiet pressed against the words as if to keep them from breaking. I stared at his hands, the same hands that had planted lilies with me, that had held the photo without hiding it. Were you lovers? I asked, or were you historians? He flinched at the precision. Not in the ordinary sense, he said. There were new hotel rooms, new alibis that smelled of soap I couldn't explain. There were meetings brief, careful, always in public. There were letters. There were calls I took outside so the car could swallow the sound. I was not faithful, even if bodies stayed where they were supposed to. Somewhere in the house, the clock repositioned its throat and resumed ticking. Why the flowers? She asked for lilies and roses around her whenever she could bear their strength, he said, voice parried to truth. I sent them first. Then she sent them to you. She said you were the present tense, and that present tenses deserve beauty. He looked down. I told her beauty becomes a weapon if the wrong person has to hold it. I let silence sit with us until it stopped feeling like a punishment and became a witness. Do you love her? He closed his eyes, opened them. I loved who I was when I was young, and she was there. I loved the part of life that made everything feel like a first draft. I loved the courage illness carved into her, because it made me want to be brave without being cruel. If love means wanting someone else's ease more than your own, then yes. If love means choosing them over your life, then no. Do you love me? I asked, not as a trap but as inventory. Yes, he said quickly, almost fiercely. In the way that has a mortgage and an inside joke and a garden where seasons keep their appointments. In the way that doesn't need an audience. He hesitated. I failed that love. But the failure isn't the definition. I let the words move through me like weather. There is a fact I clung to then, one that steadied me with its unadorned science. The human olfactory system connects directly to the amygdala and hippocampus regions for emotion and memory without routing, first through the thalamus. Scent goes straight to feeling. It does not ask permission. Perhaps none of us did. Tell me about the last time you saw her, I said. In a garden behind a clinic, he answered. She wore the scarf, more for ceremony than warmth. She laughed at the word biodynamics on a wine flyer someone had left on a bench, the lunar calendar for grapes. She said, "Imagine making calendars for courage." I told her I was hurting you by protecting her. She said, "Protection and secrecy are cousins who borrow each other's coats." He stopped, gathering the edges of his voice. When we parted, she pressed a sprig of lavender into my book and said, "Give this to Anna when you can look her in the eyes while doing it." I never did. You had to take it from the air yourself. The funeral? I asked. She won't have one, he said. Her instructions were a quiet dismantling. Friends notified in staggered notes. New assembly. She believed gatherings make grief obey schedules it doesn't respect. We sat with that, the unceremonial ending that had already begun somewhere I could not see. The moon, not yet visible, was pulling at tides that shivered against the city in small ways. In pipes, in leaves, in blood. I poured water into our glasses. "Here are my terms," I said. And the word did not feel legal. It felt like architecture. No secrets that claim to be kindness. If sorrow enters our house, it announces itself. If memory needs tending, we tend it together. We will keep the letters, but we won't curate them. We will not become curators of our own ghosts. He nodded, a relief passing over his face that was not absolution but permission to build. "Agreed," he said, "and I will answer questions you do not know to ask yet, without waiting for you to find the drawers." "Good," I said. "Because there's one more." He waited. "Why did you let the flowers make me a participant instead of telling me I had a choice?" He rubbed his chest once, like the body had learned where regret lives. "Because I thought choosing for you would spare you. I forgot that sparing is just another word for subtracting, and subtraction is not love." We let the sentence complete its arc and land. He reached across the table, not for my hand, but for honesty, and placed between us what I had wanted all along, the specifics that make or unmake a life. "First email, March dozy, 2 years ago," he said. "First bouquet to her, March 20. First bouquet to you from her, April 10. First call I took in the driveway, May 8. First time I deleted a message because I was afraid of the shape the truth would take, May 9. I wrote them down, not to keep score, but to put border stones around a field that had once had none. "Thank you," I said, feeling the odd, honest relief of coordinates. He exhaled a breath that sounded like someone stepping off a ferry and feeling the ground answer. "Ask me more, now or tomorrow. I won't ration the answers." Outside, a breeze picked up, carrying the faint suggestion of damp earth through the screen. A quirky detail Livia once loved came to mind: the way cut lilies, if you remove the pollen-laden anthers, last longer and stain less. We had learned that the hard way, yellow dust on cuffs and cushions. I thought of anthers and stains and the small practical mercies that keep beautiful things from ruining what they touch. "We can go on," I said quietly. "But we're going on with both hands on the same wheel." He nodded. His eyes shone but did not spill. He stood, walked around the table, and pulled his chair beside mine so that when we looked forward, we looked in the same direction. We sat like that for a long time, two people in a room that had hosted too many performances and was finally ready for rehearsal to become life. "There is an open scholarly debate," I said aloud, more to the air than to him, about whether truth repairs or only reveals the exact shape of what was already broken. Scholars still debate this, perhaps because repair refuses to be measured. What I knew, sitting there with his shoulder warm against mine, was simpler. Revelation had not shattered us. It had, instead, given us the pieces in a light bright enough to see where each fit. When night fell, we did not turn on every lamp, as if to banish shadows. We left some corners soft. We poured tea. We spoke of ordinary things, porch boards, and grocery lists without, pretending they were disguises for grief. In the middle of a sentence about screws and drill bits, he paused, then said, "I'm sorry." "I know," I answered. "Me too. For the ways I tried to read you like a riddle before I asked you to speak like a man." We cleared the table. In the sink, the glasses caught a ring of light and made halos on the steel. Before bed, I opened the back door and let the garden air in. The lilies did what lilies do at night. They breathed more quietly, but did not stop. Neither did we. The doorbell rang on a morning that smelled like hinted stone and cool metal, day after rain, the day after so many other days. I wasn't expecting anyone. Deliveries had stopped feeling like possibilities and returned to being errands for other doors. Still, the chime moved through the house with a familiarity that tightened my chest. Daniel was in the yard, kneeling at the edge of the bed we'd made for the lilies, his palms already brown with soil. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to the door, telling myself that memory can only enter if I unlatch it. A courier stood there, his posture half apologetic, half dutiful. He held a parcel and, in his other hand, a bouquet bound with quiet precision. Not cream this time, not blush. White upon white Casablanca lilies, pale roses, and a circlet of lavender tucked low like a benediction. The ribbon was the soft gray of morning. On the wrapping, a single line was written in ink the color of dusk, para o jardim, for the garden. I'm supposed to say, I'm sorry for your loss, the courier added, looking down at a small card he'd been told to read, and that this was scheduled months ago. He cleared his throat, as if returning a borrowed voice. You don't have to sign. I took the flowers gently. Thank you falling out of me like breath. There's a practical fact I knew even before that day. Florists can set standing orders, and friends can ask that a final arrangement be delivered after they are gone. A kindness that travels on a timetable grief never approved. I closed the door and stood for a moment in the hallway where so many bouquets had stood before, and yet this one did not feel like invasion. It felt like punctuation. Daniel looked up when I stepped outside. His face changed, but not the way it had changed in other months. There was no flinch, no defensive calm. Only a long exhale, like someone recognizing a horizon he has already named. I showed him the inked words, and he nodded once. For the garden, he repeated, testing the grammar of goodbye. We carried the bouquet to the bed we had seated with her endings and our beginnings. The ground was damp, forgiving. I knelt and unwrapped the paper. The loose knot fell open in my hands as if thread were remembering how to become river. Beneath the top layer, a slim envelope had no seal, just a fold. The paper itself bore a thin black border, a strange tender detail. In the Victorian era, people used mourning stationery like this, the width of the line signaling the closeness of the deceased, a quirky tidbit preserved in etiquette books and museum drawers. The border here was narrow, not stingy with grief, but precise with love. I opened the envelope. Inside, a card. Her handwriting steadier than it had any right to be. Anna, I promise this one is truly the last. I learned that endings ask for witnesses, not audiences. Will you witness with the lilies? Place them where your steps remember to slow. Not inside the house, where perfume argues with sleep, but here, where the air can take what it needs and return the rest as weather. I am not brave. I am simply finished. But finishing is not the same as leaving. You know that now. Keep what you have grown, the kind of truth that doesn't need to humiliate anyone to be honest. It is harder to carry and kinder in the long run. If anger arrives, let it sit in the shade until it cools down enough to speak in sentences. It will, eventually. For Daniel, please don't curate me. Tell stories where I am a street, not a destination. For you, if you ever doubt what you did here, remember the day you handed a lily to a stranger and called it forward. You taught me how to go by showing me that staying has forms I did not know. Ellie, I read it aloud, the words landing with the softness of petals and the accuracy of coordinates. We stood side by side for a while, watching silence do its work. Then, without deciding to, we moved. Daniel held the stems. I trimmed the ends. He parted the soil. I placed each bloom. We did not arrange so much as a company. The lilies found their lean. The roses found their quiet. The lavender drew a circle the wind could read. When we finished, there was a stillness so complete it felt like sound at the edge of hearing. The world did not applaud. The world accepted. I set the card on a flat stone near the bed and weighed it with a smooth river rock, the paper's black border making a small, resolute frame around plain ground. Psychologists still debate whether rituals heal, or merely structure our pain so we can carry it in public without spilling. I felt no urge to argue with either camp. My body knew only that my anger had been asked to sit in the shade, and had obeyed. A breeze came up from the street, the kind that is more temperature than movement. A familiar scent rose, not the old insistence that had once invaded the rooms, but something fainter, like a memory that had learned its manners. Lavender's main aromatic compound, linalool, is known to ease anxiety in small clinical studies. Nothing mystical, just chemistry looping back into breath, a fact disguised as tenderness. I stood there inhaling and understood, without needing to be convinced, that empathy is sometimes only the nervous system given better instructions. We stayed with the flowers until the light grew honey thick and shadows softened their edges. The pharmacy window across the road caught a fragment of our reflection and returned it without commentary. 2 people, 4 hands, 1 garden, new watchers. I thought of the scarf, the window, the habit of looking from a distance. I felt a thinning at the place where anger had once knotted itself tight. Not absolution, not amnesia. The world's truer mercy proportion. We could mark the dates in the soil somehow, Daniel said finally, not looking at me but at the line where earth met bed. Not with plaques, with bulbs. With bulbs, I agreed. Something that forgets and remembers in the right measure. He laughed softly, the first unburdened sound I'd heard from him since before the first bouquet. You always were better at naming things without trapping them. I didn't answer. I thought of clocks and cards and doors and how objects become accomplices when we give them jobs they didn't ask for. This card had only one job left, to hold a last sentence in place while wind tried to lift it. I read it again. I am not brave, I am simply finished. Finished, the word that closes ledgers and opens gates. As dusk pulled the collar from the day, a memory arrived of its own accord. The restaurant's bud vase, the sommelier's earnest superstition about fruit days, the way music can make courage keep time. People will always make calendars for what cannot be a scheduled harvest is, tide is, grief, forgiveness. Scholars still debate whether grief is a process with stages or an ongoing state we revisit like a town on a map. I looked at the bed and saw no stages, no towns. Only a place where something had been told the truth, and the truth had agreed to bloom anyway. We went inside without turning our backs to the garden, the way people leave shrines slowly, not to show reverence, but to give the world time to resume being itself. I placed the empty gray ribbon in the drawer where the letters slept, and, without ceremony, I closed it. We made tea. We ate bread with olive oil and laughed once at nothing. The house did not echo differently, and yet nothing inside it was as it had been. Before bed, I opened the back door again. Night had blurred the edges of everything into a single kindness. The lilies were only pale shapes, the roses shadows with breathing, the lavender a hush. I whispered thank you to no one in particular and to everyone who had carried this story in their pockets. The florist with her ledger, the courier with his careful sentence, the woman who believed that beauty could carry truth across a threshold if it were asked nicely enough. My anger, which had been a house guest that rearranged the furniture and left the lights on, found its coat. It didn't vanish. It stepped out for air and learned how to return as weather, not as law. Empathy did not undo what had happened. It changed the temperature of the room where it would be remembered. In the dark, Daniel's hand found mine. Not a plea, not a claim. A line drawn between 2 coordinates on a map we had finally stopped pretending wasn't ours. Outside, the garden kept its appointment with night. Inside, we kept ours with sleep. And somewhere, in a ledger none of us will see, the last bouquet was recorded as delivered. No, the days that followed did not break so much as they thinned, like fog that decides to be air again. We learned a new grammar made of pauses. He would set the kettle on. I would place 2 cups near the stove without looking at him. The whistle would rise, and we'd both arrive at the handle at the same time. Then, step back. A dance that kept the hot water from choosing one of us over the other. Breakfast returned to the table but quietly, without the old commentary about headlines and the city's stubborn traffic. The silence wasn't punishment now. It was a corridor we were both willing to walk, side by side, until we found a door that opened without creaking. It's strange how a house revises itself. We didn't move furniture, but the rooms felt remeasured. The dining table seemed less like a stage and more like a workbench. The garden door, kept ajar, became a kind of metronome for the day, the hinge clicking softly when afternoon breezes pushed their knuckles against it. Danielle fixed the loose board on the porch and replaced a faulty bulb over the sink. I started oiling the cutting boards, a small devotion to wood that had held so many knives. If you had visited us then, you might have thought we were rehearsing for a quiet opera where nothing dramatic ever happens, and the point is precisely that. We spoke when we did through tasks. Screws are in the blue tin. You left your book in the yard. Tea, not quite truce, not denial. Just the sentences that keep a day from losing its edges. There's a Japanese word I learned once, sima, the interval that gives shape to sound and form. People call it the negative space, but that always felt wrong to me. Our silence had weight, and it held what words could not carry yet. Scholars still debate whether silence heals or erodes a bond. Perhaps it depends on whether the people inside it are facing the same direction while they're quiet. We were. That was the mercy. At night, we read in the same room again. He took the armchair, I kept the end of the couch, blanket over my knees, lamp low. The books didn't matter so much as their posture in our hands, a shared insistence on attention. Once, he turned a page and exhaled in that soft, surprised way people do when a sentence folds them open. I didn't ask which sentence. He didn't offer. But the air between us warmed as if language had chosen to be communal instead of proprietary. There is a practical fact about breath I clung to in those weeks. Slow exhalations extend vagal tone and can steady a frightened body. I set my timer for 4 counts in, 6 counts out. Sometimes I heard him match me across the room, the old couple's music of synchronized lungs. We didn't call it therapy. We called it tea that took its time to cool. We marked boundaries, though not with tape. No more phone calls taken outside, no drawers that required keys. He wrote down dates on a single page and pinned it inside the pantry where onions and garlic keep their own honest calendars. I wrote down grocery lists that included bulbs along with bread, tulips for winter's end, anemones for the week we would not name, daffodils simply because their faces look like the sun rehearsing. The paper curled at the corners from steam and time, and neither of us replaced it, as if the wrinkle was a signature of continuity. Sundays became repair days. He grouted tile, taught himself the patience of straight lines. I stitched a tear in the curtain that had been snagged by an impatient chair, tiny laddered loops that learned to be fabric again. We tested the smoke alarm and found it wanting. When the new one chirped its first tidy proof of life, we laughed, too loudly for the small accomplishment it was. A fringed bit I read aloud from the manual: how ionization and photoelectric sensors disagree about what counts as danger made us pause longer than it should have. It's not just alarms that argue about what smoke means. Sometimes the garden's scent reached us with the evening news. I did not flinch anymore, but I did not romanticize it either. Lilies were lilies, roses were roses, lavender's hush stayed a hush. They lost their old tyrannical agency and returned to being citizens of weather. Once, when a petal fell on the windowsill and left a pale stain, Danielle wet a cloth and cleaned it, with the concentration of a man learning to atone in the register of ordinary gestures. He didn't glance at me for approval. He simply restored a surface that should not keep memory against its will. We set a rule without naming it. Anger could visit, but it could not sleep over. When it arrived, and it did, often in the evenings, when tiredness makes the mind unserious and absolutely poured water, he stepped into the yard. We each counted to 50 while looking at a single true thing: the ring of the moon on the pharmacy window, the line where paint meets glass, the vein on a leaf that refuses straightness yet still carries what must be carried. He began writing short notes. He didn't give me 2 or 3 lines labeled, only with the date. Later, much later, he placed a few on the kitchen table. They were not apologies, they were field notes. Today I mistook quiet for safety. Today I watered too much. Today I wanted to edit the past and settled for mending the hose. Small, honest, bearable. Midweek, he asked if we should speak to someone. A 3rd chair in the room, he said. I told him yes, but not yet. I wanted us to prove we could be the first 2, without an audience. It wasn't pride. It was calibration. He accepted that, and the very act of asking of offering structure before collapse did more for me than any appointment could in that month. The florist sent a postcard with nothing but a pressed blade of grass to paid to it and the words, "The 10th is quiet here now." I put it on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a sun we'd bought years ago at a seaside market, its paint flaking like laughter that survives cupboards and moves with you from apartment to house to whatever comes next. We did not visit the shop. We did not need a pilgrimage. Our steps grew habitual enough, just by circling the block in the evening and returning home by different streets that still knew our names. One night, the power went out on the whole street, the sudden civic hush when refrigerators surrender their hum and neighbors step onto porches to gather with their eyes. We lit candles and placed them on saucers like our parents had taught us. Shadows complicated the room, doubling the chairs, making saints out of spoons. We sat at the table and played a game we hadn't since our first year, naming 3 true things and 1 invented thing from the day. I saw a child drop a blue marble and not cry. I learned the word for the smell after rain. I found a nail in my pocket with no explanation. I touched the same page twice because the first time was not enough. We took turns guessing which was the invention. We were often wrong, which is another way of saying that even ordinary days carry more strangeness than we remember to notice. The lights returned, the house exhaled, and we left the candles to gutter naturally, the saucers warm circles we washed in the morning. By the time the month turned, our silence had changed keys. It held less ashi, more invitation. We began to speak about small futures, he painting the hallway, visiting the museum that kept a room of Portuguese tiles we'd never bothered to see, inviting 2 friends for supper with the plain menu. We both trusted bread, fish, salad, peaches. Nothing dramatic, I said. Nothing coded, he answered. I won't pretend there were no relapses. Memory stands in doorways and asks tolls you thought you'd already paid. A scent on a passerby's scarf could still lift the hair on my arms. A lavender sachet in a shop could send the old script back onto the stage. But now the cues began to misfire, losing their authority. When they did, we named them aloud and let them be boring. Boredom, what an underpraised medicine. One evening, after the dishes were done and the window had turned into a rectangle of night, Daniel said, "I miss what we were before we learned to be careful." "So do I answered. "But I like who we are when we are careful on purpose." He nodded. Careful on purpose. The phrase felt like a handrail offered on a staircase that had once been an incline. We climbed, not quickly, not dramatically, hearts holding their own opinions and agreeing, for once, to argue later. And still, under everything, the garden kept time, not as symbol, not as lesson, just as a place where living things negotiate with light. That was enough. We were enough for that week, for that room, for the next morning's kettle and the cups that remembered where to sit. By late summer, the garden had become the truest room in the house. We spent mornings there before work, coffee mugs balanced on the low stone wall, bare feet pressed to soil still cool from the night. Lilies leaned toward the eastern light as though memory itself were a compass. Roses took longer, disciplined and deliberate, opening only when heat insisted. Lavender had multiplied, it no longer whispered of loss but hummed softly of maintenance. Sometimes we worked in silence, sometimes not. Words no longer needed to carry the full freight of meaning. Danielle would point out a beetle tunneling through mulch, and I would answer by naming the color of its back green, metallic, as if forged from what light leaves behind when it bends. These exchanges were not profound, but they were honest, and honesty had become our luxury. We started inviting the neighbors' children to cut flowers for school projects. Their laughter filled spaces once guarded by suspicion. "The lilies smell like clouds," a girl said, and Daniel smiled first at her, then at me as if the sentence itself had been an act of mercy. Inside, the house shed its ghosts one by one. The drawer with the letters stayed closed, not out of fear but because we had learned that remembering and rereading are different verbs. The porcelain angel kept her quiet watch on the mantel, her folded wings dusted but unpolished. We didn't need her to gleam. We needed her to remain. In early September, the florist sent a single card. "No flowers, just a line. The ledger is complete. Thank you for keeping her appointments. Beneath it, a pressed lavender sprig, flat and scentless, the color of forgiveness, written in lowercase. I placed it in the pantry next to the wrinkled grocery list, a relic among onions. A curious fact I once read returned to me then. Pressed flowers lose their fragrance but not their chemical trace. If steeped again in water, microscopic oils rise and the scent faintly returns. Scientists debate whether that counts as preservation or resurrection. Standing there, kettle in hand, I decided it didn't matter which. Survival is its own grammar. We began marking seasons by sound rather than scent. The first cicada, the rain on tin, the hush that follows birds' migrations. Some nights, we cooked late, music low, the table set for two, with mismatched plates. Daniel had learned to shout earlier. I had learned to speak later. Compromise made flavor. One evening, I found him sitting by the garden bed, with the small gray ribbon looped around his wrist. It keeps me from forgetting that gentleness is a skill, he said. Not a mood. I didn't take it from him, didn't offer symmetry. Instead, I pressed my palm against his, the ribbon's frayed end tickling both our wrists. We're learning, I said. There was a debate, in an old theology book I'd read at university, whether forgiveness presages repentance or follows it. Scholars divided into centuries over the order. Watching him there, skin browned from sun, I realized order might be a human vanity. Maybe they happen together, the way breath and heartbeat do different instruments of the same persistence. The first cold wind came early. We harvested what we could, cut the lilies before frost claimed them, and placed them in jars across the house. Their fragrance filled every room but no longer demanded translation. Once, I caught myself humming while cleaning their vases and thought, so this is what survival sounds like when it forgets to be dramatic. Daniel suggested a trip to Lisbon, of all places. To see where her letters started, he said, almost shy. I hesitated, then nodded. It didn't feel like intrusion anymore. It felt like closure choosing its own geography. We went in October. The city was softer than I'd imagined, tiled in blues that caught the sun and threw it back as forgiveness. We walked along the tram lines she had once mentioned, the ones that made them late and therefore saved them. We didn't chase her footsteps. We simply let the city teach us what she must have learned, that beauty delays, and delay sometimes saves. On the last morning, we sat by the Tagus, watching ferries come and go, seagulls rehearsing their routines. Daniel handed me a small paper bag. Inside was a tiny bottle labeled Memória. I smiled. From a shop on Rua das Flores, he said. I thought it was time we chose the scent ourselves. I uncorked it. The fragrance was familiar but quieter now: lily, rose, lavender, and something else beneath, something unnameable. What's the last note? I asked. Earth, he said. The perfumer told me it grounds the rest. Grounds, the word felt right. We had spent so long trying to keep grief from floating that we had forgotten the virtue of weight. That night, back in our hotel, I dabbed a drop of Memória on each wrist and on the window frame. The air didn't bloom. It settled. Danielle turned off the lamp, and the scent wove through the room like breath made visible. Back home, winter began slowly, each morning leaving frost that melted by 9. The lilies slept under mulch, their bulbs storing instructions for spring. I found comfort in their patience. Some mornings I'd kneel by the soil, press a finger into the cold, and whisper, wait. I knew they would. Winter deepened slowly that year, in layers so thin you could almost mistake one day for another. The air was sharper, the mornings bluer. Inside, our world had settled into a rhythm that felt both fragile and earned. We no longer measured our days by the flowers that arrived, but by the light that fell differently on the garden wall. The lilies had disappeared beneath frost, the soil holding their silence. I sometimes caught myself glancing toward the empty bed, as if listening for them, waiting for the first green blade to break through again. Patience, I'd learned, is not passivates the act of staying in place while something beneath you changes. Daniel had taken to waking early, before the sun, to read. I'd find him sitting by the kitchen window, wrapped in a blanket, the steam from his mug drawing small clouds on the glass. Once, he said quietly, I used to think forgiveness was an event. Now I think it's weather. He was right. Forgiveness had moved through us, like a slow front, warming what it touched, eroding what it couldn't carry. It didn't erase the past, but it made the past breathable. One afternoon in January, I opened the drawer with the letters again. Dust had gathered along the edges of the wood, and when I lifted the lid, the air smelled faintly of paper and lavender, the ghost of both time and care. I didn't read them, didn't need to. I only wanted to feel the weight of them, to remind myself that love, even misdirected, can leave behind order when chaos has finished speaking. There's a fact I once read: archivists debate whether paper remembers humidity as texture. Some claim the fibers adapt permanently, others say each wave of moisture erases the previous one. Maybe that's what we are, I thought. Rewritten fibers, still holding the trace of what has passed through us. In February, the first shoot broke through, a single lily, its stem absurdly thin, carrying green like a promise it had no business keeping. I called Daniel to see. He crouched beside me, brushing dirt away with his fingertips, a reverent gesture that made my throat tighten. "It remembers," he said. "Yes," I whispered. "It always does." We left it there, uncut. Each morning, we checked its growth not out of impatience but devotion. The stem grew taller, its bud thickening with certainty. When it finally opened, its white petals faced the sky, catching every fragment of sunlight as if the air itself were applause. That night, we sat by the garden with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, the cold numbing our hands, but we stayed. The world had gone quiet enough that we could hear our own breathing sink again, not forced, just found. "Do you ever think she'd be happy knowing this?" Danielle asked, eyes on the flower. "I think she already knew," I said. "Otherwise, she wouldn't have sent it." He nodded. The moonlight touched his face, the same way sunlight had touched the lily, soft, forgiving, not interested in old definitions. There was no ceremony, no speech. We didn't need them. The flower was its own language, the garden its translation. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour, its sound traveling across the roofs and fields like time keeping a gentle inventory. I remembered the final line from one of Livia's letters. "When the flowers stop coming, don't think of endings, think of gardens resting before spring." And I realized we had been resting. Now, spring was beginning again. Inside, before sleep, I paused by the window and watched the garden blur in the dark. The glass reflected both the room behind me and the life ahead, past and present overlapping for one forgiving moment. I thought of her handwriting, of the courier, of the florist's ledger, of all the small human acts that had carried this story from loss to something else, something softer. And then I smiled, quietly, because it no longer felt like someone else's story. It was ours now, all of it. The years since have been quieter, and I've come to think that quiet is the truest proof of healing. Our home still fills with scent each spring, but it's a gentler perfume now, the kind you notice only after it's gone. Sometimes I catch it when I pass the open window, faint as a whisper reminding me that not every secret is meant to wound. The garden, once a monument, has become a living diary. We plant without superstition, prune without grief. The soil forgives what we bury, and the blooms forgive what we forget. I still keep one lily each year by the kitchen sink, its stem curved toward the light. When it fades, I press its petals into an old book, not as relics but as punctuation marks, proof that even endings can have grace. Danielle and I still speak more softly than before, not from fear but from understanding that words, like seeds, require air. We have learned to leave space between them so meaning can breathe. Sometimes visitors ask about the garden's name. I never tell them the full story. I only say, it started with a gift that came too often and ended with peace that arrived exactly when it should. At night, when the wind moves through the lavender and the first stars loosen themselves into the dark, I imagine her there for a moment, watching, not haunting, simply nodding. The air smells of lilies and rain, and the untranslatable sweetness of closure. And somewhere beneath that soft, forgiving scent, life continues, ordinary, imperfect, and beautifully alive.